Good afternoon. How are you all? Good? I can assure you, you will be better after this talk. It's going to be fun. Let me announce what's going on next week. We have Dr. Gershon Gulen from the Bureau of Economic Geology, who is visiting us, and he'll talk to us about world market for natural gas, basically supply and demand, but how, more importantly, it is really shifting in important ways the dynamics of energy globally. And so he'll also talk about some of the implications that are going on. So please join us for that. It's a great pleasure to introduce to you our speaker today, Rohit Chandra. Rohit is a doctoral candidate at Harvard University in the Kennedy School of Government. He has been working on a very, very important issue for the last 5 years or so, and you'll hear about that. But let me tell you what he's not going to talk about in terms of his background. So he got his a very interesting background. He got his bachelor's in computer science, electrical engineering, computer science from UPenn, but also got minor in political science and in economics. And then he worked for a couple of years at the Center for Policy Research in India, has also worked at 2 other places, so Brookings, India, and then Center for Advanced Study for India at UPenn. So he has this very interesting wide training that he has actually applied on the ground, and then for the last several years has been putting a lot of that broad thinking, broad training to use on a very, what I would say is a very interesting problem, which is coal in India. And what you'll hear from him is how really, what really goes on in this very interesting, deep industry in India, but more importantly, what that means for us to understand how the transition that is ongoing globally, but especially in India, might actually evolve. And maybe we all, his pitch may be that we should adjust our expectation based on a deeper understanding of the dynamics of coal industry in India. So with that, please join me in welcoming Rohit.
So thank you, Varun and Carrie, for having me, and thank you to Krista for taking care of all the logistics for this talk. So as Varun mentioned, I'm a doctoral student at the Kennedy School, and this is basically a big chunk of my dissertation work. And so today what I'll be presenting is a few chapters of my dissertation, and then towards the end of the talk, I'm going to be putting forward maybe some provocative proposals about why I think coal might last in India more than people are predicting at the moment. And so this work is based on kind of the last 6 years of work I've done on the Indian coal industry. I've spent around 18 months in the Indian coal belt, and so it's a mix of kind of archival evidence, interview evidence, and some statistical stuff that I'll show you. So my dissertation revolves around this idea of adaptive state capitalism. And basically the idea is that if you look at resource companies primarily in developing countries, a lot of them still tend to be primarily state-owned. And especially kind of in the last 20, 25 years of strong market fundamentalism, there's been a lot of maligning of state-owned companies for their financial inefficiencies, for their inability to operate, and I think this is perhaps a little bit overstated. And so I'm going to be arguing pro-coal and pro-state capitalism. I'm in great company already, I know. My dissertation revolves around kind of these 4 verticals of adaptation, and the 2 I'll be presenting today, which I think this audience will find more interesting, is kind of the technological and financial adaptation that India as a monopoly coal company, Coal India, has undertaken over the last kind of 30, 40 years. And so feel free to ask kind of political questions in the Q&A once I'm done, but I won't be talking too much about the politics in the actual presentation today. The 2 institutions you really need to understand in India if you want to understand the coal industry are the Ministry of Coal, which is kind of the high-level administrative, politically led decision-making body, which decides where all the coal is used in India. And until a few years ago, all coal allocations in India were administratively made. There wasn't kind of a coal market as such. Coal India Limited, which is responsible for over 80% of India's coal production and was formed in 1975 and exists today, but has changed dramatically over the last 40 years. And so the Ministry of Coal kind of takes a lot of kind of the high-level policy decisions. Currently in India right now, the railways and coal ministries are actually run by the same person, which leads to certain kind of efficiencies, which I'll talk about. But Coal India is kind of the main operational mining entity in India in the coal industry. There's a few smaller private companies, but Coal India dominates this space. And its operations focus primarily in 6 states in India, all of which I've visited. And until 2009, it was majority owned by the government of India. In the last 7-8 years, parts of it have been disinvested, and it's now a publicly listed company. So 20% of the company is publicly owned. And interestingly, if any of you know Indian financial markets, Coal India is part of the Bombay Sensex. So if you're replicating kind of India's main index, you're actually buying shares in Coal India as well. And so a lot of big financial firms have been worrying about kind of disinvestment or kind of not taking their money out of Coal India. And this has kind of been a problem in equity investing that people have been facing for a while when they're investing in India. And if you followed the budget recently, more disinvestment is expected. So the government of India is actually lowering its stakes in Coal India, but not losing control of the company at large. So the board of Coal India is populated primarily by political appointees or people from the government of India. You know, classic state-owned enterprise. So Coal India is divided into 7 or 8 entities which are distributed all over India. And what's more interesting is the spatial spread, actually. So if you look at where India's coal is, 95% of India's coal is within this red box. You can see some smaller deposits in the east and the west and south, but these are mainly lignite, low-quality reserves. Much of it isn't mined very well. And so kind of this block is where the majority of India's coal is produced, and this block is where Coal India operates. And it's spread over 6 different constituencies. And so Coal India actually has 6 different companies in various states which cover different parts of kind of the coal belt. And so just to give you kind of a brief history of how the industry has evolved, prior to 1947, the majority of Indian coal mines were owned by British managing agencies. So these were basically managing houses based in Calcutta, which ran coal mines all over eastern India. But after independence, obviously the British started kind of liquidating most of their ownership, and so you had a bunch of kind of Indian owners take over the industry. Unfortunately, these guys weren't very good at running the industry. It was primarily money lenders who had bought distressed assets as the British were selling them off, and they were making quick money. And so after 20 years of basically allowing the private sector to try to operate the industry and then failing spectacularly, especially in meeting India's kind of ambitious planning targets, in 1971 and 73, Indira Gandhi decided to nationalize the coal industry. And there were various justifications given for nationalizing the industry, but the main ones were that the private sector was not meeting India's ambitious planning goals. There was a lot of slash and grab mining going on. It wasn't particularly scientific. And most importantly, labor standards were being grossly violated. So the British had left behind kind of a very prescriptive labor regulation kind of law. It wasn't being followed in practice very well. And so in some ways, kind of nationalization was trying to create a company which would make, you know, Coal India some kind of model employer. Whether that happened or not is a different story, but at least that was kind of the intent at the time. And so in 1975, you know, after a few years of consolidation, Coal India was formed. And now that the government owned the industry, it had the foreign exchange to buy foreign technology. It had the ability to negotiate with international governments, which is where a lot of Soviet aid started coming in. And so not just Soviet aid, but kind of a lot more international involvement in the industry began after the government stepped in the early 1970s. Before that, a lot of these smaller private companies simply didn't have the foreign exchange or the capability of buying technology abroad. So, you know, this pattern continued for about 20 years. And then in the early 1990s, India had its big balance of payments crisis, right? So far what had been happening was that Coal India had basically gotten its entire capital budget from, or capital expenditure from the Indian central government's budget. And so while operationally it was going fairly well, financially it wasn't in such good shape. And so once the subsidy regime was withdrawn in the early 1990s as India affected a lot of its financial reforms, Coal India had kind of a major financial crisis. It was short of about kind of $1 billion of investment money, and the Indian government didn't have that much money to invest, so who do they go to? Of course, you go to the World Bank. And so the World Bank actually stepped in 1995, 1996, and between 3 different loans gave about $800 million in loans to the Indian government at the time. This is something they don't like to admit these days, But at the time, this was basically saving the Indian power sector and kind of downstream industries as well. And so obviously, this came with a lot of conditionality. Coal India changed a lot of its internal operations, which I'll talk about in a little bit. And so Coal India actually recovered fairly well, and kind of the logical conclusion was the IPO in 2009, where the company was profitable enough and operationally sound enough, followed all kind of the ISO 2009 regulations and everything, that international markets were actually willing to invest equity in Coal India. And so kind of if you look at kind of the production history of Coal India, these are the various subsidiaries of Coal India. You don't really need to know what all the acronyms are. The one thing you should notice is that if you look at these bottom three subsidiaries, which are basically Bharat Coking Coal, Central Coalfields Limited, and Eastern Coalfields Limited, these three subsidiaries are more or less stagnant. Their production has not changed dramatically in almost 40 years of production. And these three subsidiaries were actually kind of the big problem in Coal India's financial kind of well-being. Most of the growth in Coal India actually came from other subsidiaries, which rather than being in Eastern India, were actually more in Central India. And I'll show this spatially in a little bit. One of the big trends in the Indian coal industry, which is kind of what's happened globally in most areas, is that there's been a huge trend towards open cast or pit or strip mining, as you might call it. And so this is kind of the exact same story in the US, right? Kind of West Virginia and Kentucky to the Powder River Basin. Well, the same thing happened in India. And so as you can see, underground mining has more or less stagnated in India as a kind of absolute amount. In terms of overall production, it's overwhelmingly in the public sector, right? Not a surprise, Coal India runs the industry. However, there are some smaller private companies which have gotten mining licenses. And recently, in the last few years, as kind of private auctions has happened, this number might increase as a percentage of the whole a little bit, but it's still fairly slow. So this is kind of fascinating how much the spatial spread of the coal industry has shifted in the last 40 years. So in 1965, you can see how two districts basically make up almost a third of all coal production in India. Actually, one district makes a third of all coal production in India. And basically, Dhanbad and Raniganj, which are kind of two of the historically well-known coal-bearing areas, are responsible for the majority of India's coal production. Fast forward 40 years, and you can see that kind of the mean center has actually shifted dramatically. Now you can see that central India and states like Orissa, Chhattisgarh, and Madhya Pradesh are actually far more involved in the coal industry and actually produce the majority of India's coal today. And so, this has a significant effect on the politics, which I'm happy to discuss later, but kind of these are the facts on the ground. Please ignore that dip, that's a bit of an artifact, but one of the biggest things, and you can see that the colors have remained the same in my graphs, is that when Coal India was formed in the early 1970s, it wasn't just a mining company. It was also part of the bigger Indian welfare state. And so naturally, as state-owned enterprises do, it had a lot of functions. It built hospitals, it built schools, it built roads in a lot of the areas which it went into. A lot of its operations were in Eastern India, where basically state governments were investing very little. And so if you go to places like Bokaro, Dhanbad, Raniganj, Asansol, a lot of these towns were built entirely around the coal industry and still depend on it largely today. So some of these employment figures were, let's say, inflated or politically motivated to put people on the rolls who weren't actually working as a way of kind of redistributing. And various politicians at the time were very good at kind of convincing Coal India to do this. Obviously, this became a big drain on financial resources. And so after kind of the liberalization moment in the early 1990s, and especially after World Bank loans kicked in, one of the big reforms that happened was you need to get the excess labor off the books. And so as you can see, the three unproductive subsidiaries I was talking about earlier are the ones which also tend to have the highest employment. Now, these were kind of unmechanized underground mines, so you did need more people. But you didn't need that many people. And so a huge part of kind of the reforms over the last 25 years has been slowly decreasing the manpower within kind of legal limits and just not hiring more people in those areas. For example, Coal India used to have a very generous policy of anyone who was displaced when Coal India acquired lands for its mines, their family automatically got a job in the company. Those kinds of practices were completely discontinued. And so Coal India today has kind of around 300,000 employees, which is less than half of what they had at the time of nationalization. And so why should any of you care about this? This is why you should care about it. India's power fleet is probably over 65, almost close to 70% based on coal-based power generation. And as you can see from kind of these IEA graphs, energy mixes actually move pretty slowly. And so kind of the politics of the Indian coal industry and India's dependence for it in terms of power generation has a huge implication for climate politics, kind of all the projections that people are doing about climate change. And so kind of this is the main reason it matters. And as you can tell from the way I'm arguing, I'm skeptical that this is going to change anytime soon. You can see kind of the gray part, which is renewables and other kinds of energy, and it's actually fairly small, although it's expected to expand a little faster than it has already. But you know, that brown chunk isn't going anywhere. So a little bit about kind of how Coal India has evolved over the last 40 years. So what you can see is that until the early 2000s, Coal India is actually not a very profitable company. But this is kind of an artifact of pricing policy in India. So until at least the mid-1990s, the India government was basically pricing coal at cost. The point was that since all of the capital expenditure in Coal India was actually being paid for by the government, they didn't really need to make profits. That screwed up the incentives within the organization enormously. But you know, basically, one of the conditions of the World Bank loans was that pricing should be kind of liberalized. And so from the early 2000s onward, Coal India actually got pricing power, and you can see that it's been making considerable financial profits now. And in fact has made, you know, its cash reserves have shot up enormously in the last 5-10 years, which the Indian government has been using to various ends, which I'll talk about in a little bit. And so what you can see is similarly kind of the divergence between kind of the sale price of coal and the cost of coal starts from that kind of early 90s period onwards. But if you disaggregate this between underground and opencast mining, basically what you find is that underground mining is hugely loss-making. Except for a few highly mechanized underground mines. Most of India's underground mines are not profitable and should have been shut down if kind of the social motive did not exist in the first place. Since that is kind of one of the political constraints, not all of them have been shut down, despite some of kind of the financial rationalization measures that Coal India has taken. On the flip side, opencast mining is basically where all the profits are coming from. And so this is kind of the real capital-intensive scale activity which Coal India has undertaken. And then, again, we're back to our delinquent. The three subsidiaries which are problematic have only really become profitable from the early 2010s onwards. So the majority of Coal India's profit has been driven by kind of those 3 or 4 central subsidiaries, which I pointed out on the map earlier. And so there's kind of a serious regional divergence happening here. So I think one of the things which is least understood about Coal India, even within India, is that there is actually a huge amount of, so there's a few really big changes which have happened within Coal India. So first of all, after the World Bank loans kicked in, a lot of kind of the socialization practices which existed earlier were removed. But more importantly, a lot of private sector subcontracting was the way Coal India reduced costs. So when people say that kind of Coal India has a monopoly in the industry, it may be in ownership, but the subcontracting ecosystem is actually very, very competitive. And so today, over 65% of all of India's coal production is actually being done by subcontractors who are running mines for Coal India. So in some ways, Coal India is almost more of a mine management company than a mining company, at least in terms of feet on the ground. And so, you know, this has a long history, which I'm happy to go into a little later on. It started with kind of basically transportation contractors who worked their way into kind of mining over time. And one of the things that has worked in India is that it's developed a fairly low-skill opencast mining methodology, which is not supremely capital intensive. And so the barriers to entry for a transportation contractor to actually enter and run a mine once kind of the mining engineers have planned it is actually relatively low. So, you know, just to show you how this has changed over time using Coal India's own data, basically departmental production is production from Coal India's own employees. Hired production is production from kind of outsourced mines or mines given to private subcontractors. And as you can see, it's starting to kind of go over 50%, almost 60% of all coal production. And so this subcontracting ecosystem is actually very fertile. I think that's a source of most of the efficiency gains in the coal industry. But you could also consider it, if you're cynical, which I am a little bit, a form of labor arbitrage, right? Where basically it costs too much to hire your own employees because costs in the public sector are too high. So you're essentially paying private employees less to do the same kind of job, right? And so there's kind of serious political and distributional consequences to this. But at least financially, it's actually made coal mining in Coal India much more efficient. Obviously, this has big implications for kind of union politics and everything, which I am happy to talk about a little bit afterwards. And so, okay, India is in this kind of relatively low-skill mining equilibrium. It doesn't have the most advanced coal industry in the world. It actually has pretty bad quality coal, so there's no export capability. But damn it, India has some of the cheapest coal in the world. This is the thing that people at Coal India are actually quite proud of, that per kind of calorie, India produces some of the cheapest coal in the world, and this is after kind of prices have been allowed to float a little bit. And so this is just kind of using data from the BP World Review. The India number is kind of an aggregate of all the coal and different prices, weighted average of all of it. But India's coal is actually pretty damn cheap. Unfortunately, it's also pretty bad quality, so there's no export potential for it at all. But at least domestically, it seems to be working, right? So that's the financial side. What's happened on the technological side? And I've kind of referred to this a little bit in kind of the open source, Opencast versus underground debate. But basically, there were a few big shifts in the mindset in Coal India after nationalization. So before 1970, which is before nationalization, the majority of India's coal industry was run by kind of in British-style underground mining, which is very little mechanization, very manual, and actually pretty inefficient. And kind of partly because managing agencies ran this industry for a long time, very little other technology managed to make it in. Once the government took the industry over, there were basically about 10 years of sustained competition where India basically worked with different countries to try to bring different mining technologies. And so at the time, the French, the Polish, the Soviets, and the Germans were all sought as technology partners, and Soviet mining technology ended up winning out. Where were the Americans in all of this? Well, Coal India was a public sector company. On principle, the US didn't lend to a lot of kind of publicly owned companies. They only lent to private companies, so they kind of lost out in this race a little bit. And so the majority of kind of India's historical mining capacity and tech expertise all comes from Soviet collaboration. But from the mid-1990s onwards, as the World Bank loans kicked in, basically you had an open market. The tenders that were floated for kind of the 24 big open-cast mines that were using World Bank funds were kind of open global tenders. Lots of global mining companies started entering the scene at that point. And so India actually now has a fairly fertile mine machinery manufacturing scene within India. Some of it is imported, some of it is manufactured domestically. And none of the big mining majors exist in India. So the Rios, the BHPs, the Glencores, none of these guys. But the mine machinery guys certainly are selling a lot of machinery in India these days. But, open-cast mining isn't going anywhere, right? So unlike China, which has managed to kind of succeed at the long wall revolution where most other places have failed, India is more or less abandoned underground mining, except for kind of strategic purposes. A few mines are still open. And so we talked about this. As I was talking about, there's a huge regional divergence in kind of the productivity of mines. So the mines basically in Madhya Pradesh and Orissa are very, very productive. And so the others, much less so. And this is nowhere near kind of international standards. If you look at kind of Australian productivity per shift, it'll be somewhere around 5 to 10 times this much, but that's also because they don't have excess labor on their books. So maybe kind of productivity per shift is not the best measure. Maybe a capital intensive measure may be better, but this is the data I could get. So, but there's always constraints. And the biggest constraint in the coal industry over the last 10, 15 years in India has been the evacuation problem. So Coal India is pretty good at getting the coal out of the ground, but getting the coal from the pit head to the power plant or the cement plant or kind of the steel mill has actually been fairly difficult, partly because Indian Railways has been a very inefficient state-owned company. And so there's been a lot of substitution towards road-based transport of coal over trucks, which is quite inefficient, and transport costs have become a big part of kind of the variable cost that power plants have been facing. And so this is something which India is trying to fix right now with freight corridors and kind of building more pithead plants. But this is kind of one of the major problems that exists in kind of the Indian coal industry today. And so I think this is something that people tend to blame Coal India for a problem, which is actually a burden which many organizations bear. Coal India is not the end transporter, and so kind of Indian Railways actually ends up bearing some of this blame, which I think a lot of people tend to kind of misdiagnose. And so hopefully in all of this, what I've convinced you is that, while state control of the industry remains, state operation doesn't, right? Kind of the private sector is involved. It may not be at the ownership level. It may not be kind of passing on all the profits to the subcontractors. But there is actually a fairly fertile subcontracting ecosystem which has come up. And so I think this is pretty good evidence that Coal India hasn't been a stagnant organization, right? Whether you call it backdoor privatization or reform by stealth, I think a lot of internal changes have happened in the company. And so when people start arguing about kind of breaking up this big monopoly of a company, I think it's been operationally pretty efficient, and there's a lot of political advantages to having a big state-owned company which can procure at scale, which can coordinate with many other state-owned organizations. India is a bureaucratic place, and the less bureaucracies you have to interact with, the better it is sometimes. So, while coal mining in India is not anywhere near the technological frontier, the form it takes right now seems to be working for India. So that's kind of my spiel on the coal industry, but now why do I think it's going to last longer than it is? And this is kind of, I'm taking off my historian hat and putting on my kind of public policy hat to some senses. So, when I was walking through campus earlier, I saw that there's a play on Enron, which is going to happen somewhere on campus. I was fascinated by this. And Enron actually has something to do with this story as well. So in the mid-1990s, Enron planned this big gas plant in Maharashtra, the Dabhol plant. And this plant, unfortunately, for various reasons, the power purchase agreement that Maharashtra, the state, signed, they reneged on it. It was a huge catastrophe. The project went belly up. And so did India's credibility. Every major bank in the world, well, most major banks in the world had a piece of the debt in this project. And the moment Maharashtra reneged on this agreement, basically infrastructure finance in India became taboo for most international banks. So basically international money, except for aid, dried up for infrastructure financing in India. So where does India get the money? It basically raids depositor money. The entire banking system in India is run by the government. This is not something uncommon. I think China and a lot of other countries have done this. But what it means is the stock of Indian infrastructure, including its coal power plants, are primarily debt financed by India's nationalized banks. And if you start backing down India's coal plants, which to some extent you've seen some evidence of already, the first thing it's going to hit is the cash flows which these banks are expecting. And that's going to cause huge macroeconomic problems for India. So the main reason I'm a little skeptical of kind of all this kind of shuttering of coal plants and that coal is going to be backed down, and that, when green tech media and Forbes start jumping up and down and saying the renewable revolution has arrived, I mean, maybe it has, but you can't shut down these coal plants unless you restructure all the cash flows and all the power purchase agreements so that you don't wreck India's macroeconomy. So that's one problem, right? That there's kind of a direct macroeconomic impact if at a system level you start backing down coal in a big way. And the second thing, which I think Arvind Subramaniam, India's chief economic advisor, has articulated fairly well, is that kind of the RE less than C story in India is not clear yet. Yes, the auction numbers and some of India's capacity auctions for solar have hit record low numbers, but at least the national solar mission plants had all kinds of subsidies thrown at them, whether it was land, you're not considering the intermittency and integration costs. And so I think in all this enthusiasm kind of, and Sarang probably knows this better than I do, there are major integration costs. India's transmission system is barely a national kind of grid in some senses. And so I think it's going to be a while. You can look at 5 different studies and find 5 different versions of where kind of the RE versus C story is. Will this happen, this RE less than C moment happen in a few years? Probably, but I don't think it's there yet. The other thing is that there's been a lot of buyer's remorse among Indian distribution companies. So there were solar projects bid out 3-4 years ago, and they were far more expensive than they are now. And because India's utilities are all state-owned and they're not used to honoring contracts, they turned around and said, well, we don't want to honor the old contracts. We want everyone to meet the new prices. That's not how power purchase agreements tend to work, but this is how Indian utilities try to manage the system, especially because they're so bankrupt. And so I think there is definitely kind of, especially from the utilities perspective, kind of a wait and watch mentality where, look, it might even go down further. And so this is something kind of economists can do much better than I do. But I think, this is part of the mentality which exists in a lot of kind of India's financially distressed utilities. And then finally, and I think this is something, so the perceived injustice of hasty transitions, energy transitions, has affected both American and German politics in the last few years, right? And I think this is something which may happen to an even bigger extent in India. So Coal India may only employ around 500,000 people permanently or through contractual employment. But given the spillover effects of the coal industry in a lot of these areas I was talking about, and I'm formalizing estimates of this, I think over 20 million people would be affected if you started closing down the coal industry overnight. And part of this is a spatial issue. So if you look at kind of India's coal map, right? It's all in eastern India. If you look at India's RE map, it's basically concentrated all in western and southern India. Eastern India also happens to be the poorest part of India. And so you're taking basically a critical industry for large chunks of that region and replacing it with something which is going to be concentrated primarily in western and southern India. This is going to have serious political consequences. I interviewed a lot of people in Coal India and I asked them, there were multiple bills proposed in the Indian Parliament to break up Coal India and privatize the industry. Why didn't they ever pass? And they were like, because 100 MPs would start up at any given time and protest against the bill. I think there are elements of that which are still in play. And then finally, everyone's been talking about kind of India's 175 gigawatt target, right? Most of it is running at 10% capacity utilization. And so what we see is kind of, while the RE capacity numbers in India are definitely going up, the actual percentage of the overall generation mix is actually staying relatively constant, right? It hasn't grown that much. And so, India is still building coal-based power. 175 gigawatts of solar and wind combined is the equivalent to about 70 gigawatts of coal-based power, depending on your capacity assumptions. And so, this is moving fairly slowly. And so I'm not saying that kind of the renewable energy revolution won't come to India, but, it's going to take time. These ideas are copied directly from Václav Smil. And basically, energy transitions take time, they take consensus building, and they take coordination. And that makes me a little more cynical about the immediate short to medium term future of kind of renewable energy in India than kind of a lot of the commentary I've been seeing. So thank you for your time. I hope you found this interesting, and I'm open to any questions.
Any questions? Joe, take that one.
Thanks, Rohit. It was a great talk. Just a couple of questions. One was about your shuttering of old coal plants, and you pointed out a number of constraints, no doubt. But on one constraint, maybe I have a slightly different view, which was about the debt owed to banks. Now, there's a chunk of Indian coal plants that are really, really old,
right,
that have been essentially depreciated and are no doubt cheap in terms of power generation, but they don't
probably paid off most of their
debt
already.
Yeah. So there's quite a bit of capacity there where that factor wouldn't apply.
So that's maybe 20 out of 180 gigawatts of coal? maybe?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know. I remember hearing something like 30 or 40, but I'll have to look at my notes. But
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
not, it's a minority.
Yeah. But I mean, it's not insignificant.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. So that was one point. The other one was on your RE lesson C. That's the big $1 million question, isn't it?
Exactly, right.
So at the CEA, I was told last year, and they have run this calculation.
That's India's Central Electricity
Yes,
Authority.
Central Electricity Authority, which is sort of the technical arm to that aids the regulators. They have done the math on this, and they have come up with the grid integration cost for renewables to be 1 rupee 50 paisa. That's the Indian currency, 1 rupee and 50 paisa is a unit below that per unit, per kilowatt hour. So if you kind of add the low end of the auction prices, the bid prices for solar to that, you get around 4 rupees per kilowatt hour as your total cost, including all of the grid integration.
Yeah, which is roughly on par with coal. Right?
Which is, I think, below new coal. It's above old coal, but
yeah,
it's,
if you're building like supercritical and all, then it goes
right.
up a little
Or
bit,
any
right?
new coal plant now today is between 4 and 5. In some cases, a little higher than 5. So at least on it seems like renewables are at parity with new coal plants in India.
Right. Yeah.
Now again, it depends, because if you're right at the pit head, you're going to be cheaper and so forth. But
There's some variation
yeah,
on that number, but
yeah.
on average, yeah.
On average, we are kind of there on new coal plants. So on a differential basis, on the margin, it looks like solar is there. Now the governance challenges that you pointed out all make sense.
Right.
As barriers. And the last question, just a comment on the setup you're saying about it's going to take time. So I think that's all relative, right? It's about what do we expect? And the media, of course, has headlines, but you rightly pointed out that energy transitions literature talks of between 25 and 75 years for any transition historically. Renewables, if it gets to 25 years, that's actually doing pretty good by historical standards.
Right, yeah, exactly. So yeah, I mean, some of this is just mediating between kind of historical timelines and like media timelines, right? So, yeah. But no, thank you, Saran.
Thanks.
Yeah, go
Hi.
ahead.
All right, thanks for a great talk. I had a quick question about, at the end you just said something along the lines of Eastern India is the worst part of India, and I've never been...
Poorest.
Oh, poorest.
No,
okay,
I'm
makes a
from
lot more
Eastern
sense.
India. It's
I
not
was
the worst
confused,
part
and
of
that's why I wanted to check. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I'm sorry if that sounded that way.
Yes.
Yes,
What
sir.
did India promise at the Paris Climate Summit?
Yeah, so the two main kind of commitments were a capacity target of how much renewables it was going to build, and an energy efficiency target. And so far, India is well on track to meeting both of those. In some ways, they weren't super ambitious targets, so I mean, in future versions that might be revised a little bit. But in terms of India's commitments at the Paris Agreement, they'll be easily met. I think that's not the logic for why India should be pursuing renewables, but yeah, in terms of international agreements, I think India is well ahead of its commitments.
So a couple of days back, I read a news article, and in that news article, it was mentioned like India is really bringing in foreign private players in this coal production, because a couple of years ago, the estimated target was about 435 million metric tons, but India could produce only 325. Because of which India had to really import the rest of the coal from foreign countries. So what do you think now that the big international players are going to come into production? How is this going to change? That's my first question. And second is about this, you said why coal will persist. So one of the reasons I see is that India doesn't have enough oil or natural gas, but India has abundant coal, huge coal reserves that can power the country for next 100 years. At least 70 years, and which is cheap. So why should India really invest, not consider coal as the very good option and try to use technology and reduce the environmental impact? Thank you.
Yeah. So in terms of commercial coal mining, this is something which is very, very recent. This literally happened 4 or 5 days ago. And as I showed earlier, kind of private coal mining is a small chunk of overall coal mining in India. So even if kind of private coal mining takes off in a big way over the next few years, it'll take at least 5-7 years for most of this capacity to come online. I'm not super optimistic about like big international mining companies entering India. I mean, on one hand, these guys have a lot of cash and very little room to, very few places to spend it. On the other hand, like mining in India is a very risky activity, and without good local partners, it's very difficult to do. Sorry, what was you had another part of the first question.
Yeah, so how do you think, like...
Yeah, so
Indian private players are also...
yeah, so I mean, your numbers were a bit off on overall production. I think of the 650 million tons produced in India last year, Coal India produced about 85% of it, which is like 530 million tons. So the numbers are a bit off, but the larger point is taken that India has had to import coal because it hasn't been able to produce it domestically. So essentially, because of the evacuation problems that I were talking about earlier, it wasn't just kind of a production problem. Because of evacuation problems, a lot of the new private plants that came up were built on international coal, imported coal. So primarily Indonesian and Australian coal. Private plants on the coast may still run on that kind of coal, but basically this government has made a commitment to basically phasing out imported coal for state-owned plants at least. And most of the state-owned plants are spec to Indian coal. So, I mean, the import scenario will exist for a while, but I think as a percentage of overall coal production, it's definitely going to go down. And then the second question about why should India give... I mean, you're making my argument for me, but I think that's not the right argument in some senses. I mean, the energy security part is important. India has enough coal reserves for over 100 years. It will not use it for that long. You know, Coal India put out a vision document a few weeks ago, and they're anticipating a plateau in coal demand in about 15 years. So, I mean, in some ways, in the long run, I think there is going to be substitution away from coal, mainly for kind of domestic, environmental, and climate reasons, right? And, I mean, I agree with you that energy security is important, but like enough alternatives seem to be developing that, you know, in 20 years, I'm going to have to do research on something else. I don't know if this is going to be a growth industry anymore.
Hi, here, back here.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Oh, well, thank you. And I was wondering if you have an idea of the wind resources in the eastern side of India, because I think, like, I was wondering if, like, whenever it's time for the coal power plants to retire, if they could be, like, that land could be reclaimed with, like, wind turbines or something. So, like you said, that the solar resources on the western area are,
Yeah, so
like,
the right
better.
map is a wind density map.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. And so the red is kind of the higher part. So basically, eastern India is not good for either solar or wind, unfortunately. I think the exception could be the coast. So if you start doing something offshore, that's completely different. But you know, that's kind of a different ball game altogether. I think, yeah, other than like, so most of what I've been talking about is grid connected. Off-grid is kind of a different story. Off-grid makes a lot of sense for rural, remote areas for a bunch of reasons. But in terms of grid connected, I seriously doubt it'll come up in eastern India anytime soon. I think what's more likely is it'll be developed on the west and the south, and the transmission capacity will be improved, which won't be cheap, but it's possible. Josh? You mentioned... Oh, sorry. Sorry.
Thank you for a great talk. I just had a question. So, I mean, we know coal is a big thing in India, and it's been developing, and naturally research shows that it's getting better and the production is getting ramped up. But the idea is that in India, there are around 300 million people with no access to energy or electricity.
Right.
So the idea is, if this is a resource that's so abundant in India and it's being used, but it's still not being able to supply what is equivalent to the entire population of the United States with electricity, is it really prudent to keep, pushing in that direction if there are problems with transporting it, evacuating it, or anything? Or should India should start pursuing something else? Because I'm not even discussing the climatic or environmental factor. I'm just discussing the very, human right of energy and electricity.
So I think this is a larger critique, not just of coal, but of kind of the grid system at large, right? And this is something where I think off-grid has huge potential in India. So most of the arguments I've been making are because, of state financing of big grid-connected projects. I think off-grid, the main problem right now is that 90% of Indian villages are connected to the grid, but they don't get quality power from it, right? They get it for an hour a day or something like that. And so grid connectivity isn't so much of the problem as curtailing, quality of service, all of these kinds of things, which, I have to admit, the Indian state does not have a great track record of. So if people start substituting towards decentralized renewable energy, go for it. But you're charging the poorest people who don't have power the highest cost of energy because of the higher cost of kind of decentralized. And so there is that balance. If you go to rural India, one of the prevailing sentiments which frustrates a lot of people is that everyone thinks that the grid is coming soon, right? Or power is coming soon. And this is what kind of the entire political system revolves around talking about these things. And so I don't disagree with you, but I think that's more of kind of a distribution problem than a problem with coal per se. You can generate with whatever you want, but it's more a critique of India's distribution companies that because their service obligations are very different and they don't honor them, and they would rather curtail power than buy expensive power and all kinds of weird incentives which exist. And so, yeah, if people find effective ways of bypassing the grid, go for it. I don't think the economics of that is great yet. It's improving, but I don't think it's there yet. Josh?
You mentioned that Coal India is quite profitable and that they're using some of their reserves for some other purposes, and when we talked earlier, and right. One of the purposes that carbon sequestration was very popular as a prospective technology 10 years ago, and I feel like it's kind of run out of steam, at least as a animating idea that could save us. But you keep, at least from a climate perspective, but you could imagine that large-scale demonstration projects or other things could be financed with some of these surpluses. And I'm just wondering is that something that Coal India is thinking about as a way of extending the time horizons that they might be able to operate, or if what else is they're thinking, what else they're using the money on, if not CCS, what else?
Yeah. So Coal India has developed considerable cash reserves, and this government has basically made it a policy that they've been using part of the reserves to build solar plants or to finance some kind of electrical EV kind of electrical vehicle kind of grid upgradation kind of stuff. My sense is that Coal India, at least kind of the board members I've talked to and the people who run the company, aren't worried about the combustion side. And so CCS is way far off the imagination. These are not people who take huge risks. If there was a push for CCS, it would have to come top down from the Ministry of Power or kind of one of, some kind of courageous minister who wants to push a project. It's not going to come from these state-owned companies which have improved considerably, but are not risk-taking in that sense. Also, I think, at least my sense of CCS, and Varun would have known this better than I do, is that India is definitely not in a first mover situation when it comes to CCS. No one I've talked to in the power sector in India ever, the demonstration projects which are working in the developed world are problematic at best. Why should we start putting money into this? It seems like a moonshot right now. Maybe I'm more cynical than most, but I don't see Coal India doing it. What's more likely is some kind of international consortium financing this, and maybe they'll pull some money from Coal India if that happens.
Yeah, I'll ask a question. I think I take your sentiments on CCS. Agree with them probably. I'll try to build on a sort of earlier question. You're calling it the distribution of coal, or to potential power plants, or how the infrastructure to distribute coal. Usually these are criticisms of renewable energy, right? So you can't take it's only windy and sunny in some place, and you need to distribute the power via the transmission lines. And if you it's too bad. It's sunny in the Southwest U.S., but if we only had the transmission. So
exactly.
So in some sense, do you see? Well, India's got either both potentials or both problems, right? You can't distribute the coal if you want it, and maybe this has some historical legacy into why. I guess that's one question. Is this problem of distribution of coal responsible in any way for the lack of good quality electricity generation, or is it still just the distribution companies? And even if you had good power plants and they were spread around the country well, that you would still have poor power quality?
Right.
Maybe, I don't know. That's your potential insight. And so if you already have this distribution, second question, if you already have this legacy distribution problem with coal, then is the argument like, look, you've had 30 years to try to create a coal power grid that actually was reliable, and that's what everybody in the United States says, coal's reliable, and that's what you need. Well, it hadn't happened in India, and you've had a long time. So,
Why start now?
Forget that, done that. Let's, try to make it happen with renewables. Yeah, there's issues there, but hey, we haven't even tried there, so let's go there, and maybe you can get better financing from the global community.
That's good. So I don't think the evacuation of coal is responsible for kind of the financial problems of Indian utilities. I think that's much more of a tariffs problem, undercharging agricultural consumers. At worst, that might cost them, maybe like 5-10% of the power that's generated because of quality problems. But at the end of the day, the financial problems aren't because of kind of the quality of coal or the inability to evacuate it. So yeah, that I don't think is the problem. I agree with you. So here's kind of the main problem that's existed in Indian Railways for a long time. So Indian Railways has had this kind of fantastic policy of running freight and passenger railways on the same lines. And basically that slows down all the freight massively. So in the last 5-7 years, they've been investing in freight corridors. And in fact, some of Coal India's surpluses have been invested in kind of better freight evacuation. So is this a problem which should have been solved 30 years ago? Absolutely. I think part of the problem also was that a lot of power plant siting, especially in kind of the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s, was very politically motivated. And so ideally, you should have had a lot of pithead plants near where the mines were. Instead, what you had is plants distributed all over the place, very far from the coal. But India had this kind of weird policy of freight equalization, where you had a postal rate for the transport of coal over any distance as a way of kind of socializing the resource. And so now that the economics has caught up to it, kind of those policies seem like, the power plant siting is extremely problematic. So I don't disagree that kind of this is a dysfunctional system which has been in the works for a long time. I think in some ways kind of, this is what kind of Albert Hirschman used to call kind of the zigzag of development, right? That kind of you push on one front when you can, and then you switch to the other one very quickly. Essentially, like coal has been pushing very hard for the last 15 years. Railways has been somewhat stagnant. In some ways, kind of there's a switching that's happening right now. I think that the economics of coal by wire in India are still better than the economics of renewables. And so logistically, it may be a little bit complicated, but at least the finances seem to be working out right now, at least with all the legacy plants that India has. I mean, forget about kind of the new ones which are coming in and more expensive. I think there's a very short window in which that'll be true, like less than 5 years. And so there's definitely people within the government who think that, look, there's 5 years where this economics makes sense. Let's just build all the coal plants we can before kind of the economics falls apart. I don't know if those are the people who are winning the battles in government right now, but this is kind of one of the prevailing debates that is happening. Not entirely unlike what's happening in the U.S. right now. So,
yeah, thank you again. So can we pull the thread on that a little bit? So here we see that the renewables tend to be the lowest cost. So
exactly.
There's new plants,
right.
Coal's shutting down, and you wouldn't think about building a new one. Can we pull this? So that 10%, I have multiple questions. The 10% of the villages that don't have any power, are the economics such that you could have inexpensive photovoltaics, inexpensive lithium batteries, and have a system there, a village microgrid that has competitive costs, and you're not dragging wires out there and such not.
Right.
Is that something that you see growth, and will that grow enough to expand? And then the 90% of the villages, and maybe you could subset that only have, you said, an hour a day?
Something? I mean, the distribution is very wide, but yeah, like...
Distribution's wide, but, I mean, what's the cost per kilowatt hour? Are those PV storage microgrids with LED lights, to say, to charge cell phones and such not, they're still not competitive with the classic grid bringing power in. Is that true?
No, so yeah, I think there's been a fair amount of assessment of microgrids in India, and the main problem is the 10% that don't have power often have very little purchasing power in the first place. And so, I mean, those are the people you ideally want to target and give free power. But the economics of microgrids aren't working because the microgrid is inefficient. It's just like the purchasing of power of people in
How do they charge their cell phones? Do they not even have cell phones?
I mean, in some areas, they don't. The thing that's taken off the most is actually not the battery-powered, so not microgrids so much, but solar-powered lanterns and kind of solar-powered charging stations. Yeah, that's actually fairly common. And so those kinds of things are actually being taken up quite widely. I think when you start building the microgrid and all kind of the fixed investments of metering and then expecting people to pay regularly, I think that's where it starts falling apart, partly for behavioral reasons, partly for other things. But there's been a lot of experiments. People at UChicago, I think Johannes Urpalainen has done stuff. Brookings India just put out a paper on this. It's on the cusp where kind of no company would, unless it's hugely subsidized, no company could make money off of this so far, which is why microgrids haven't taken off in a big way. I think within 5-7 years, I anticipate that'll happen. But that's also kind of the timeline in which this government, like many governments before it, is promising kind of 24/7 power and connectivity and all of these things.
And so maybe you could segment out. So the villages may have different power profiles or applications, certainly than Bangalore with high-tech and server farms and all that. But if we could talk about the villages, what are the different applications besides cell phone charging? Because my understanding is they do banking transactions and communications, so that's essential, maybe refrigeration for medicines. It's a very small number of applications.
Yeah, even refrigeration is a stretch. I mean, I think cell phone charging, basic lighting, and then honestly the next thing a lot of people go for is TVs.
For World Cups and...
Yeah.
Okay, so those three things. But so is there enough of concern with the quality or the duration of availability of power, or even if there was no storage to reduce the cost, it was just PV and it had it 10 hours a day versus 1 hour a day, and that's when they could watch it.
Yeah,
and is that competitive in those villages where they have a grid?
Yeah, so I think it is competitive, but then often the problem ends up being the last mile maintenance problems, right? So solar panels, you install them once, hopefully they'll last for at least 5-10 years without any problems. But often you'll have some kind of circuitry problem, someone will bump into it and crack the glass, something along those lines. And then the amount it costs to get someone in to fix it and do all of these things, I think it's primarily a financial problem that there aren't good financial products in India to spread out the cost over time. And so, this is something that one of Varun's students next year is going to look at. But I'm not an expert on this. I don't look at decentralized very much, so you're pushing my capabilities here a little bit. But my sense is, wealthier people in villages can afford it, but, poorer people can't. And so, you definitely hear of people who kind of run power kind of charging systems out of their house, right? Where you can plug it in and you can give me a few rupees, this kind of thing. And so it leads to all kinds of like local entrepreneurialism, but I don't think at an average Indian income in a village, people can afford that right now. That might change soon, but that's my rough sense, and with all the caveats that I mentioned earlier. Yeah. Can I add a point to that? Yeah, Sarang might know this better than I do, actually. So.
The off-grid market is very limited in India right now. There's been some development lending and solar lanterns and the like that have propagated, as Rohit said. But in terms of supplying electricity to households, there are a few private players that have come in and are providing microgrids in places like Bihar, eastern states.
Right.
But the tariffs they're charging are 20x of that of grid power.
Yeah, that was my sense.
And that kind of ratio, they justified by saying that the transaction costs for doing that, these are these are very remote areas relatively. I mean, they're not so remote in terms of being in the middle of the forest or something. It's just the transportation, the connectivity, the basic infrastructure that we would take for granted here in the US or even in a wealthier Indian state does not exist. So the companies argue that this is what it takes to get power to them. Now, as long as the household just wants one light bulb and one fan, maybe they don't see the cost as too high. But scaling that in anger is not feasible with this kind of a cost differential.
Right.
So the cost differential has to be at grid scale power or close to it. And we don't know the internal rate of return of these companies. They're privately held. So we don't know whether, what their profit margins are, but it looks like it's an expensive solution right now.
Thank you.
Well, even in the U.S., you had to have a sort of political push to get the rural areas connected, rather from a private profit perspective. Thank you very much for a really great talk, Rohit. I thought it was very informative. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you so much, Kerry.
Yeah.